It's a great organization. I see some friends in the audience. Hesitate to say old friends, but it's a long time. And perhaps we'll make some new ones tonight. I hope I'll generate enough disagreement so there'll be an actual debate. We'll see if that. Okay, let's start with some current events. We have in Orange County a village that's dissolving. Apparently the citizens of this village feel that they're going to lose local control of their government, to a burgeoning Satmar Hasidic majority. Now, New York passed a Local Government Empowerment Act in 2009 under the guidance and influence of the former Attorney General, now Governor, to encourage the dissolution of some of the 551 villages in New York State. There have been 20 votes under this act. 5 villages have dissolved, and they were in very extreme circumstances financially and demographically. So it's unusual that a village comes forward and seeks to dissolve. Second example, Kiryat Yoel, the Hasidic community in Orange County, an insular religious community, seeks to annex territory. And people are urging that the county, a higher level of government, intervene so that this village does not lead in the annexation process. So movement of the decision, or an attempt to move the decision from a local to a more regional government. The East Ramapo School District has been taken under control of a state monitor because the Hasidic majority is not defining community and serving community in the expected way for all the people in that school district. And there have been negative consequences for many people in the community. Now, I don't propose to attack the Hasidic community tonight or make that the core of my remarks. But I find a common denominator, that there's a difference in the idea of what constitutes community, in what the Hasidic community thinks and what others think who have a place-based concept of community that's inclusive of all and that is driven by certain norms. And I would propose to you that governance and community are not the same thing. Municipality is not the same as community. But we are inclined to conflate the two. We are inclined to conflate municipality and community. And we are inclined to believe that community is threatened when local government is brought into question. In fact, people are willing to abandon their local governments when those local governments, in fact, are not convergent with their idea of community, but diverge from their idea of community. Now, as I talk to you about regionalism tonight, I want to maintain that distinction in your minds between the idea of community and the idea of municipality. We tend to make them into the same thing, and we tend to react as if community was threatened when we raise questions about the performance and function of municipalities. And these examples suggest that people value community more than they value municipality when push comes to shove. Now, simultaneously with these examples, we have examples of inclusion. I worked on the City of Newburgh Charter reform. Some of you may know about it, and essentially what we did was redefine. We did a number of things. I think we did a number of good things. That's for others to judge, I suppose. But one thing we did was redefine. We got the city to agree to make legislative districts a part of its city council, and that assured the election of a Hispanic member to the city council, inclusion of a community that comprises about half the city's population. So that's an example of adjusting government to create inclusive community rather than threatening community and having to dissolve government or move the decision from the local to a different level. Now, simultaneously, as some of the town supervisors in the room know and some of the county officials know, the local governments are under state mandate to prepare a plan on how they're going to cut 1% of their tax levy, and they're also under a state limit on their tax levy of 2% increase per annum. And that report is due soon, I think we're working with Albany County on this, and I think at the end of May, if I'm not mistaken. So certain financial incentives are being offered to dissolve villages, and they're being offered to local governments to work together, and they're being and carrots and sticks are being brought forward. And what's remarkable and interesting about these, first of all, it's very interesting that the state premise is wrong. The state premise is that you have to induce local officials to control property taxation. To me, that's really a funny idea. When I was a local elected official, our primary concern was to control property taxation. So what we're proving in Albany County, by the way, is that local officials have already done this far in excess of the state's expectations. And so they meet the requirements without even, almost without getting out of bed in the morning. But that's a whole other story. So what this points to is relative to the questions that have been prepared for tonight that I happened to see. So I don't think that's cheating. They were sent to me. Right? And the questions are fiscally based, right? Are we going to save money by doing government a different way? And of course, that's forward. That's a concern because we're very highly taxed in this state. But when fiscal values and community values come into conflict, the fiscal motivations are often not primary. You know, people won't take the fiscal incentive when they think it threatens their idea of community and when they conflate the idea of community with municipality. They will respond to the fiscal incentive if you don't threaten the idea of community, if you incorporate and engage the idea of community toward the fiscal goals rather than in conflict with the fiscal goals. There's a whole other set of facts that people are local oriented, and there's been a recent poll sponsored by the New York State Conference of Mayors. There are many sources of evidence on this. But people trust local government more than state government and more than national government, and they value local government more than state government, more than national government. But what does local mean? Local is inclusive of New York City, which happens to be the fourth largest government by size of budget in the United States. It's in legal terms a local government. It includes Orange County, which when I last looked had a $750 million budget. There are county legislators here who can correct me, but I think that's ballpark. And local includes the village of New Paltz and all the towns in this county, and the city of Newburgh and the city of Port Jefferson. So what does local mean when we're trying to advance local? I think we can have local at different scales. So when we juxtapose regional and local, the question is, what does regional mean and what does local mean? And we can get into a discourse about language, but I would suggest to you that these are very inclusive terms. They include a great range of scales and sizes. So when I talk about regionalism, I'm talking about scale that's appropriate to the task. It's important that and it's important what the task is, and it's important then to distinguish one task from another. It's not an accident that the book I wrote on this, which is now so old that it could be called a classic, the title was Regionalism and Realism. It wasn't regionalism or realism. What can we realistically do regionally, and at what scale are we going to be able to do these things? We are seeking various values in our governance. We're seeking efficiency. We're seeking equity, fairness. We're seeking competitiveness. A lot of the argument for regionalism is, we're not competing with other places very well because government costs too much, and we have to cut down on the numbers of governments and so on, the numbers of people working for government. And what we're seeking, of course, we're seeking community. So in that book, I talked about 4 values, and I talked about aligning those values in determining the scale at which we did things. We won't always go for efficiency if it threatens community. We may want to have more expensive government. Some people buy, I use the term Cadillac, but that shows that I'm 70 years old. It's not the most expensive option these days. We won't go for equity if we're attacking community. Now, these are abstractions, but you can imagine what I mean. If if you just argue that you should be fair to some other person, but you feel that that person is threatening your community, you're not inclined to fairness because it's threatening to your fundamental values. So we have to align the values in our consideration of governance. Now we're doing all this in a context that's pretty, that I've communicated with all or some of you many times. That is, we're doing this in a 19th century environment when it comes to government. Our governmental heritage is a 19th century set of facts. Some of you may be interested in knowing that occasionally I go to libraries and I actually touch books. This is kind of old-fashioned. and I walk around and look at things that are next to other things. The most interesting way of finding out things you don't know is to get a book you're interested in, go into the stacks and see what's next to it on the shelf. And one day I went to the state library, I was researching regionalism, and I discovered a proposal, a mid-19th century proposal, to divide this county into two counties, and to make Newburgh a county seat, and to attach the eastern part of Ulster County to that county, and cut Ulster County down a bit. We don't think about creating counties anymore. That proposal was an ambitious one for lawyers and politicians in the part of the county who wanted to have their own courthouse and their own county clerk and their own county elected officials and so on. They failed. We stopped creating counties in New York State in 1970. Our town, when the Bronx was created, which isn't a real example, the last county that's operating as a government that was created was Nassau in 1898. So we haven't created counties, we haven't created towns, we haven't created cities since Rye in 1942. We have a paradigm, we have a structure that's based on a set of premises and ideas about how to organize territory that is not contemporary. Now that doesn't make it bad, but it's not contemporary. Our villages are still relatively dynamic. And I could talk about the special districts too, but the point is, it's a 19th century paradigm. Now that doesn't suggest to me that it's going to be optimal for doing certain tasks well, efficiently, and effectively. But we embrace that structure because we're defining community and municipality as one thing rather than thinking of community and municipality as distinct things. We have high property taxes, we have a lost economic base, we're struggling with these 19th century lines. We have incremental adaptation of our governments to do things. What does that mean? It means that towns weren't defined to do the things that towns do. Now towns are defined to provide rural government. But people moved into towns and we got tired of creating villages as a solution, so we started to empower towns. That's roughly accurate from a kind of a general descriptive way. So now we have, I hate to say this because of my name, but we have a jury-built system. and it's not a system at all, it's a result of history. And school districts are an extraordinary example. We levy our property taxes in a way that essentially we assess at one level, we tax in multiple jurisdictions, and we have a whole bureaucracy to adjust the situation for equity. Cool. You know, that's essentially what we do. So that we can treat people fairly, we have to maintain multiple bureaucracies at multiple levels to approach equity. Nobody would design anything that way. And nobody would defend that, I think, if they were starting from scratch. We also have a democracy deficit, and we were talking at dinner about the fact that we have voter participation problems. But to me, the fundamental democracy deficit is the accountability problem. I was an elected official for 12 years, and I often talk about people approaching me in the supermarket, which is a fundamental experience of a local official. They're accessible, and saying, can you help me with my Social Security check? Can you help me with my before the town court with this DWI arrest that I unfortunately experienced? People don't differentiate among their local officials. They think they all are somehow politicians who are elected, and they approach them. Well, you can't hold people accountable if you don't know what they're supposed to do. You know, and the situation is so overlapping and complex that it defies easy understanding, and the complexity then diminishes the capacity to hold people accountable and and keeps democracy from working well. Now that's a big, big point, and I know time's limited, so I have to watch out but we always talk about government reform in economic terms. We don't talk about government reforms in communal terms, and we don't talk about government reform in democracy terms. And our obsession with the financial side is appropriate. We are heavily taxed, and we'd like to be less taxed and have lower costs. But it's not the only question. And if we want to address the financial stuff, and I think we can't attack the communal values that are so much at the core, and we can't forget the democracy requirements and the accountability requirements. So what can we do? We can find ways to behave at different scales while honoring and protecting the other values that are engaged. What does that mean? In Albany County, we're working with the county and we're filing this report for every municipality in the county and the special districts and the fire districts. So almost 30 governments have signed on to this report. And when we went around and talked to everybody in Albany County who was the head of a local government who was agreed to sign on, it's hard to get almost 30 governments to sign on to do something together where there's no apparent. The benefit was that we did the work, so they didn't have to do it. But we went in and interviewed everybody. And we know that if they had shared accounting and computer-based accounting system, they could manage better, they could manage more effectively. We know that if they could afford the technology, the communication technology, several towns could work together on dispatch more effectively and efficiently. They tell us that. They're willing to do it. They don't have to be forced to do it, but there are barriers not political barriers, not personality conflicts, there are barriers in resource acquisition at the front end to make the efficiencies down the road. And so that's what we're learning. Use technology to preserve and regionalize local government without attacking community. I went down to Watson Labs and I told IBM, Jerry tells IBM, it's biblical. I said, I go through airports and you've got this technology that you're selling to all these big cities and countries, smart cities program. I said, most people in New York State, 5 or 6 million people live in rural areas. It's an enormous market. And they said, we can't sell those places one at a time. There's no money. And I said, don't sell them one at a time. Go through me and we'll sell them all. Let's put the technology in the cloud, sell the small places the technology, and have them use the technology to do comparative analysis of their costs and performance, and we would benefit them all without abolishing anybody. So we can reach scale through the use of technology. That's another example. Schools and schooling. Do certain things to make it possible to work together. Do you know when we studied the schools in Ulster County, nobody had the same bell schedule? How could you offer a class that kids in 3 different high schools could take at the same time if they were all if the classes weren't convening at the same time? Busing, bell schedules, food service, jails and jailing, so collaboration to avoid costs, materials management, assessment. We can't accomplish county assessment at the county level because it requires constitutional change, we think. But there are counties in Western New York that are simply contracting with all the local governments and effectively accomplishing county level assessment without shifting the formal function. And the county government here in Orange County has been doing some contracting with town government to do that function. So solid waste. I think we should be responsible for our solid waste, not shipping it off somewhere into Never Land and burning all that gas and creating all that pollution and not acting responsibly. Of course, we should recycle and diminish I'm virtuous on that, but a local or regional solution to a problem that we're exporting. And sometimes we should say voter registration. Senator Gillibrand says voters should be able to register at their computer. Certainly they should be able to register at the village hall or the town hall. Some things need to be scaled down. Some things need to be scaled up. We should examine what scale we need and achieve that scale. And that's what regionalism means. It doesn't mean abolishing governments. I think that some governments are going to disappear. And they're going to disappear like vestigial organs. They'll stop functioning because they don't have ultimately anything to do, and the people won't want to persist. We'll still have community without government, like we do in Clintondale, like we do in Highland, like we do in many communities that have, don't have governments but are content with their town governments and are content with being hamlets. Let me close here. I promised Lou that I would be reasonably responsive. I was watching Sesame Street the other day, and the reason is I was going to start with which of these things is not like the other, and that's why I speak, but I chickened out. And then I looked at this in my neighborhood, and who are the people in my neighborhood? Some stores had people living above them, like my grandma did. Others were the cable guy. He worked in the region. He worked for a company that had a concept of service delivery in the region. The postman, well, he was at a different scale. The librarian. Services are provided in the private public sector at a scale appropriate to the task. And we have to harness government to that end. Not abolish governments because we think it's inconvenient to have them. Not threaten community, but to advance democracy and to achieve economy, which I think we can do. We have to rethink the scale at which we deliver things and move toward the scale appropriate to the function.